I'm Danny Mando, and I am the convention chair. And this is certainly, for me personally, a highlight of the virtual convention. It's a culmination of really 2 years' work. So excited to have Micah. Before I give you his formal introduction, just so you know, Micah Goodman has been to my shul. He's actually a member. We actually have him on the pulpit. When he's not there, we just say he's out of town. And you are in for quite a treat. My shul is Temple Emmanuel in Newton, Mass. Micah is out of this world, and the timing of this could not be, I guess, better, as literally we are in a transition period in Israel from the government. But let me give you a formal introduction, and then I will let Micah take it away. Dr. Micah Goodman is a research fellow at the Kog-Od Research Center at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Yerushalayim. He is a leading voice on Judaism, Zionism, the Bible, and the challenges and opportunities facing Israel and contemporary world Jewry. Micah is the author of several Israeli bestsellers. Most, probably the one that you're most familiar with is his 2017 book, Catch 67, that rose to the bestseller list and prompted many discussions about the ramification of the Six-Day War as its 50th anniversary. His newest book, The Wandering Jew, Israel and the Search for Jewish Identity, was published in 2020. Micah lectures regularly overseas and at Israel's leading universities, think tanks, and cultural venues to audiences that include Israel's political and national leaders. Among other venues, he has lectured and taught at the Knesset and the official residence of Israel's president. Micah has a doctorate in Jewish thought from the Hebrew University of Yerushalayim and teaches at his alma mater. He is a member of the recently formed Global Forum of the National Library of Israel, and it gives me so much pleasure to give you Dr. Micah Goodman. You're on.
So, as you mentioned, Danny, Israel is going through a very exciting, interesting moment as we're talking. As we're talking here in the Knesset, there's a very bumpy, rough moment of transition of power from Netanyahu's government to a new government that is a hybrid government. It's a hybrid government because it has hardcore right-wing parties in it. It has real centrist parties in it. And it has hardcore left-wing parties in it. So this is a very interesting transition from a Netanyahu Haredi government to a new, fresh, hybrid government. It's something we've never done before. And one of the big questions that comes to mind when we shift into this new government is a hybrid government, a paralyzed government. Are right-wingers, left-wingers, centrists going to be so busy destroying each other in their arguments that this government is not going to work for the people? It's going to be busy within its own world. Is a hybrid government a paralyzed government? We don't know the answer to that question, obviously. The government wasn't born yet. It will be official only 2 hours from now. And this is Israel. It's possible it won't even happen in the end. We're living in the age of unpredictable politics. But I believe that a hybrid government doesn't have to be a paralyzed government. I believe that a hybrid government could actually be a very effective government. And the reason to that is that within Israel, we have something that you don't have in the United States of America. And it's something that even most Israelis have a hard time recognizing. We have an unspoken, invisible, broad Israeli consensus. Yes, here's the thing. Most Israelis agree on most issues. This is not like America. Here's the difference. By the way, I'm Israeli, completely Israeli. But my mom is from Oklahoma. And my dad is from Massachusetts. So, and I know something about my mom's world in Oklahoma and my dad's world in Massachusetts. Oklahoma and Massachusetts seem like they're two Americas. And there's constantly clash between these two different Americas. America is very polarized, and the polarization within American politics is a reflection of the division within the American society. The same thing in England. British politics is very polarized because England itself is very divided. Then we come to Israel, and same thing in Poland and Hungary and Brazil and Argentina. The division within politics reflects a division within the society. And then we come to Israel. And Israel is the following paradox. In Israel, the division and the polarization within the politics doesn't reflect a divided society. It actually hides and masks the fact that society itself is not that divided. This is the paradox of Israel. So you ask, what will be the vision and platform of a new hybrid government? Exactly that. The silent, unspoken Israeli consensus. The fact that 80% of Israelis agree on 80% of the issues. That's the policy. That's why a new hybrid government, only in Israel, could actually become an effective government, because it cashes in on the silent, unspoken, unverbalized Israeli consensus. This lecture is about that consensus. This lecture is about what are Israelis arguing about. So our argument has three generations. Generation one, from let's say 48 to 67. We should actually say 48 to 70, 77, depends how you count. But the first generation, we had a socialist government led by Mapai, which was the Mifleget Poalei Israel, the party that united the workers. It was a socialist government. The founding fathers of Israel were socialists. Then you have Menachem Begin speaking about privatization, free markets, smaller governments. And that was a battle that was the first generation of the Israeli debate. That debate, socialism versus capitalism, started somehow calming down, where different processes happened that led that debate to be much less heated. It was replaced in the 70s with a new debate, the debate over the territories, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, the West Bank and Gaza. And now being a right-winger doesn't mean you're a capitalist, it means you're for more settlements. Being a left-winger doesn't necessarily mean you're a socialist, it means you're for peace. It means for withdrawal from the West Bank. And that was the new debate. They replaced the old debate, socialism versus capitalism debate. Replaced it. Now we have a new debate. Land peace, that debate, which you're all, I'm sure, very acquainted with. And then something happened. This debate started losing its energy. And it barely exists in Israel today. And it was replaced with a new debate. I would like to say, I'm not proud of this debate, a shallow debate. It's not a debate over capitalism for socialism, land, or peace. Now it's a debate over the character of a person. Netanyahu, do you admire him or despise him? That's it. So it's a very shallow debate. Maybe now that Netanyahu is not governing, I'm saying this is a big maybe. We'll stop arguing about the nature, the character of a person, and we'll start arguing again about ideas, policies, and issues. But here's a question. Why is it the debate over the West Bank started losing its power? This is what the next half an hour is about the rise and collapse of a political debate in Israel. So this debate over the future of the West Bank has two important moments. The first moment is in the 1980s. There were two very fascinating and charismatic visions that were clashing. The left said that if Israel leaves the territories that Israel conquered in the Six-Day War, we'll have peace with the Palestinians, with all the Arab countries. And when we have peace with all the Arab countries, so European countries will really and truly accept Israel. They will see Israel as a part of the nation, of the family of nations. And then that sense of Jewish isolation, that we're alone in history, will end. The sense that somehow the whole world is out there against us, it's us against them, that sense of isolation will end, which means peace will heal Jewish history. It will normalize Jewish history. Peace became a messianic vision. One thing you do, you leave the West Bank, you heal the relationship with the Palestinians, with the Middle East, and with the entire world. And that was an exciting vision, very exciting vision for many Israelis. There's another group of Israelis that in the 1980s had also a very charismatic vision. It's the following. The problem of Jewish history is not that Jews are not connected to the world, to the rest of humanity. That's not the real problem. The problem is that we're not connected to our history, to our tradition, to our identity. And here's why. The Bible took place in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. That's where our memories, the memories that inspire us, that's where it took place. That's where our prophets prophesied. That's where Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, this is where it all happens. Here, by the way, in Eretz Israel. And where does Jewish history take place? Outside of Eretz Israel. So when Jewish history takes place outside of the land of the Bible, that gap, that separation of Jewish history from Jewish territory, that separation is a separation that disciples of a great mystical rabbi, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, they thought that that gap means that there is something unhealthy within the Jewish psyche. And once Jews return to their ancient land, settle their ancient land, Jewish history will take place where the Jewish great ideas, prophets, where the Bible was born. When that happens, those ancient prophecies that the Jews will return one day back to their lands, when those prophecies become realities, the Mashiach will come, redemption will come. So you have two exciting visions of closing the gap. One vision, the vision of peace, closing the gap between the Jewish people and the family of nations and humanity. To end the exile, not the exile from land, the exile from humanity. To end the loneliness and of Jewish people, the sense of isolation of one nation among the nations. To redeem Jewish history. That's the vision of peace, and the vision of land is to close the gap, not between Jews and humanity, but between Jews and their history and their identity and their land, and to take these ancient biblical prophecies, turn them into the reality, and pave the way for Mashiach, for Messianic times. If you want to just notice that these two visions have a lot of similarities, because they're both born as a result of the 6-Day War. Once we have this land, we ask, what do we do with it? One side says, let's leave the land and have peace. The other side says, let's settle the land and have redemption. So they both have these utopian visions that are a result of one question. How do we leverage the victory in the 6-Day War? How do we transform victory into redemption? By leaving the land and making peace, or selling the land and making peace with ourselves, with our identity, with our history, and bring Mashiach. These are two, how do we leverage? And there was, by the way, both camps, both ideologies, they are clashing now and replacing the old clash between socialism and capitalism. The war changed the debates. Both camps, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, somehow believe that pretty soon most Israelis will see their lights and join their camp, join their movement. And they have one more thing in common, and that is that they were both wrong. What I mean they were both wrong, in the past 53 years, ever since the war till today, most Israelis didn't join one of the camps. Most Israelis are disenchanted from both camps. Most Israelis come to Israel, bump into an Israeli on the street, ask him or her, do you believe that peace is around the corner and all we have to do is leave the West Bank and peace will happen? Almost all Israelis will ask you, what are you on and what's this joke? Because you'll sound very, very silly. And if you'll ask the same Israelis, do you think that we sell the West Bank so somehow we're returning to biblical land of our past, that will trigger messianic events in the future. What are you talking about? Most Israelis find both utopian language very weird, very not connected to who they are. Why is that? Why is it that these two ideologies born out of the Six-Day War were rejected by most Israelis 53 years after the Six-Day War? The answer comes from the First Intifada and Second Intifada. This is a great idea I'm borrowing from Yossi Klein Halevi. The First Intifada was a real blow for the Israeli right. The First Intifada, I would say, the image of the First Intifada, 1987, massive uprising, and the image of the First Intifada is a 10-year-old Palestinian holding a rock. On the other side of that image, you have a soldier with a helmet and a gun. That's a troubling image, right? That asymmetry. A 10-year-old Palestinian with a rock. And a 20-year-old Israeli soldier with a helmet and a gun. It goes against everything we loved about the Six-Day War. The reason why Jews in Israel and all over the world admire the Six-Day War, because it was tiny Israel fighting 4 Arab countries. We were David, they were Goliath. They were supported by the Soviets. We were all alone. We were David, they were Goliath, and we won. Now suddenly you have these images, and it seems like, who's David and who's Goliath now? You see, when we conquered that land, we were David. Now that we're hanging on to that land, we're Goliath. These images were a real blow for the Israeli right. If you have to understand, for Israelis, these are not just images. For American Jews, yeah, these are troubling images. You read the New York Times and makes you feel uncomfortable. For Israelis, this is much more than being uncomfortable, because in Israel, we have this amazing institution called Miluim, reserves, which means you can be 33 years old, an accountant in an office in one of the buildings of Tel Aviv, and you're called back to the army. Just think about that. You put on a uniform, you say goodbye to your boss, you say goodbye to the wife, bye to the kids, you leave everything behind, and you go back to the military. But they're calling you, and then something is weird. They're calling you in the First Intifada to chase 10-year-old children with rocks. And people serve in Miluim and reserves for 30 days. If their officers 40 days, sometimes, I'm not exaggerating, 50 days, and they come back home and they ask themselves, what are we doing here? And we did not sign up for this. We're Zionists, we're patriots, we're soldiers, we love our country. We want to serve in the military to protect our nation, not to control a different nation. That's not what we signed up for. This moment of collective recollection, that is not what we signed up for, has numbers attached to it. In the beginning of the First Intifada, only 20% of Israelis in 1987 are for a withdrawal from the West Bank and the formation of an independent Palestinian state. 20%. By 1993, towards the end of the Second Intifada, now the numbers are closer to 70%. That's what the First Intifada did. For many Israelis, the Intifada was a blow on the myth of sacred lands. Yes, this land is our land and the prophets were living here. But now that I'm chasing 10-year-old Palestinians in Tulkarim, I realize it's not only the memories of my nation are planted in this land. There is a different nation living today, real people on this land. That moment of disenchantment that happened in the First Intifada that led Israel to vote for Rabin, Oslo, and it created a lot of optimism that maybe we should leave this land. Maybe we should make peace. And that's the 70% that are for withdrawal from the West Bank in 1993. But you see, if the First Intifada was a blow for the Israeli Messianic right, I'm choosing my words carefully now, the Second Intifada was a fatal blow for the Israeli Messianic left. Because now the Second Intifada, the living symbol of the Second Intifada, is not a 10-year-old Palestinian holding a rock. The Second Intifada that begins in 2000 in the fall of 2000 is very different in its nature. The second Intifada, the symbol is not a 10-year-old Palestinian holding a rock. The symbol of the second Intifada is a suicide bomber. And many of you probably remember the second Intifada already, where buses were exploding, shopping malls were exploding, restaurants were exploding. Over 1,100 Israelis are murdered in these explosions of the second Intifada. In March 2002 alone, 230 Israelis are murdered in different bombs blowing up. It was, remember this very clearly. It was horrifying. Some of you maybe know Emek Rafaim Street. I was living around Emek Rafaim Street. Was all the restaurants, which are always flourishing, were empty in 2001, 2002. I remember my father asking me to go and eat in these restaurants just to make sure that, that's our answer to terrorism. And terrorism works. Terrorism in Latin means fear. And that was the point. Israelis were terrified. And I got married in 2001. I'm not complaining. I was saying a large portion of my family did not come to the wedding. That's terrorism. People that don't want to come. Don't want to go out for dinner. That's terrorism. But I want to make a point here. It's not the viciousness, it's not the violence of the second Intifada that was a fatal blow for the myth of peace. It wasn't about how violent it was also about that, but it was mainly about timing. It wasn't about the character of the second Intifada, it was mainly the timing of the second Intifada. When does the second Intifada begin? Less than 2 months after Camp David. Let me just refresh in your memory. In the summer of 2000, 3 leaders go to Camp David in order to make peace. Bill Clinton, Yasser Arafat as the representative of the Palestinians, and Ehud Barak. All 3 of them go to Camp David with one goal, to end the conflict. And then Barak makes Arafat an offer. Now there's a lot of writing about what was the offer that Barak made Arafat. But I want to explain the Israeli debate. So what's important is Israelis understand Barak's offer to Arafat. Not what really happened, it's a question of historians, but how did Israelis experience Barak's offer to Arafat? So here's how it's really. Barak offered Arafat everything. Now, when we say everything is what we actually mean, complete withdrawal from Gaza, almost complete withdrawal from the West Bank, partition of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem, and compromise on Temple Mount. Bill Clinton, in his autobiography, he writes that he couldn't believe how generous the offer was. It was unprecedented. It was way beyond what the Americans imagined that an Israeli leader will offer a Palestinian leader. Dennis Ross writes somehow the same. Shlomo Ben Ami, Ehud Barak. This is like the classic narrative of what happened in Camp David. And how did Arafat answer Barak's offer? He said no. Personally, I don't think, as an Israeli, we should be judgmental of Arafat for saying no. He has a narrative too. That has to do with 1988, giving up already then. I won't go into it. He has a narrative too. The thing is that 2 months later, the second Intifada, less than 2 months later, the second Intifada begins. So what does this mean? When buses are now exploding in Jerusalem, just after Barak offered to leave the West Bank, end occupation, now you ask an Israeli the following question. Now you're in year 2000, asking an Israeli on the street, saying the following. Do you think all this violence, buses exploding, is a result of the occupation? Well, Israelis will laugh at your face at that moment. Because all this violence can't be a result of the occupation, because all this violence began 1 minute after we offered to end the occupation. That's why the second Intifada was such a fatal blow for the myth of peace. We offered to leave the West Bank, and the answer wasn't peace. It was the second Intifada. Now, by the way, there's also an argument within the Israeli intelligence community that Arafat planned this, or it just happened that he joined it. I won't go into this debate. I just want to say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the history is clear. Barak makes an offer at Camp David, and 2 months later, less than 2 months later, we have the second intifada. We offer to do our best to end occupation, and after that, violence breaks. So the narrative that violence is a result of occupation in the minds of not all Israelis, but almost all Israelis, that narrative collapses completely. The result is that Israelis stop believing that peace is possible, and that leaving the West Bank will lead to peace. There's a lot of evidence for this on polls. I won't go into this now. I just want to notice that two ideologies are born out of the 6-Day War. Land ideology, peace ideology. Land ideology, clobbered in the first intifada. Peace ideology, destroyed in the second intifada. Where does that leave us? Many Israelis, even after the first intifada, still believe in the myth of land. We have to build more settlements and everything will be okay. Some Israelis, even after the second intifada, still believe in the myth of peace. There are not many of them, but they're still there. We just have to make, one more effort, offer them something we didn't offer last time, and we'll have peace. But most Israelis are disenchanted from both ideologies. Where does that leave Israelis? Well, here's where it leaves us. In the first intifada, we've learned that we don't want to control the Palestinians. The second intifada, we learned we can't make peace with Palestinians. What do? This perplexity, this confusion of not all Israelis, but most Israelis, could be expressed the following way. They kind of became convinced from the main argument of the right and the main argument of the left. Here is the main dominant argument of the right in the past few years. They said that if Israel leaves the West Bank, it puts Israel under real threat. And here's why. We just try to we have the flavor of that in the last battle we've had in Gaza a few weeks ago. A few weeks ago, see, in 2005, Israel leaves Gaza. A year and a half later, Hamas takes over Gaza. And ever since then, the lives of Israelis living 10 miles from Gaza is miserable. Sderot, it is very close to Gaza, and it gets attacked with missiles periodically, and psychologically speaking, the life in Sderot is horrible. It's even hard to even explain to Americans what it would be like to live in a town where every now and then there's a siren and you have 15 seconds to run to the bomb shelter as part of your life's ritual. So Israel leaves Gaza, and 50,000 of Israelis living in the periphery of Gaza, 10 miles from Gaza, become miserable. What will happen if Israel leaves the West Bank? So it's fair to say that not with low probability, maybe high probability, what happened in Gaza will happen in the West Bank, which means the lives of Israelis living 10 miles of the West Bank will look like the lives of Israelis 10 miles from Gaza. But you see, 10 miles from the West Bank, we don't have Sderot, we have Netanya, Kfar Saba, Petach Tikva, Rishon LeZion. 5 million Israelis live within 10 miles, including Jerusalem, by the way, Modi'in. Most Israelis live in the periphery of the West Bank. So you can understand. Oh, and as somebody told me in the last operation in Gaza, when there was rockets on Tel Aviv, and people in Tel Aviv, as you know, were what? They say they had the flavor, 1 week of what it means to live in Sderot all year. But that was also like a promo of what could happen to Tel Aviv if Israel leaves the West Bank. If Israel leaves the West Bank, Tel Aviv could become Sderot. So that's why most Israelis don't want to leave the West Bank. But also most Israelis don't want to stay in the West Bank. Why? Because they're persuaded by the most important argument of the Israeli left. And that is, there's 2.6 million Palestinians living in the West Bank. If we stay in the West Bank with our military, eventually those 2.6 million Palestinians will be completely absorbed into Israel. With Israeli Arabs, which today is a very good day for them, by the way, with Israeli Arabs, Arabs that have Israeli citizens, with them. They're not a majority, but they're close to a majority. And they could become a majority. But even before they're a majority, if it's 60-40, Israel's not really the nation state of the Jewish people anymore. It's a binational state. It's the end of Zionism. So that's why we have to leave the West Bank if you want to protect the Jewish majority that will enable Israel to be the nation state of the Jewish people. So when you're persuaded by the right that we can't leave the West Bank, and if you're persuaded by the left that we can't stay in the West Bank, if you believe that if we leave the West Bank, we are risking our national security, but if we stay in the West Bank, we are risking our national majority, then you're really in trouble. Not all Israelis buy this analysis. Some Israelis on the right say, yeah, we could stay in the West Bank, nothing will happen, it's all okay. Those numbers of Micah Goodman, they're just a leftist. Don't worry, it's all good. Some people on the left say we can leave the West Bank and everything will be okay. Because we'll have peace, we have to trust them, and the international community will guarantee our security, and all this stuff that most Israelis don't really buy. But if you're afraid of staying in the West Bank and leaving the West Bank, now you're extremely confused. And here's my news to you. Confusion is the new state of the past 10 years of most Israelis when it comes to the conflict with the Palestinians. Most Israelis agree. They agree that we shouldn't stay in the West Bank and we can't leave the West Bank. That's the unspoken agreement among Israelis. That's the catch. The catch 22. If you stay in the West Bank, you're threatening your future. The solution is to leave the West Bank. That will threaten your future. I don't call this a catch 22, as most of you probably know. This is a catch 67. This confusion. So how did most Israelis, now that we're confused, like, okay, so if we stay in the West Bank, it's not a good idea. If we leave the West Bank, it's not a good idea. What happened, I'm saying this sadly to most Israelis, let's just stop dealing with this West Bank thing. There's nothing we can do about it. The problem is when you stop dealing with something, it is dealing with it. It's prioritizing the status quo. But that part in our debate was neglected, not because we solved the problem, but because most Israelis feel like we can't solve this problem. So that's why this debate started deteriorating. In the vacuum of that debate, a new debate arose, the debate over Bibi Netanyahu. So that's a very brief summary of the birth of the political debate between right and left over the West Bank. And how this debate deteriorated, it deteriorated because confusion kicked in. Radical confusion started capturing the hearts and minds of most Israelis. So this was 35 minutes. We still have 25 minutes to go. I think I put a lot on the plate. I think it's a good idea maybe to stop now, take some questions, and I'll try to wrap it up with the question, what can we do regarding this conflict?
Oi, all right.
Okay.
And just so you know, my phone is going crazy because people, not like myself and the Temple Manual people, but you know, who's Micah? Now it's like, wow, you were right. This guy's great. But you do have a lot of questions, and I'll try to ask them one at a time and see how you can do. But this is a great one. How many American Jews can tell the difference between Likud, Labor, Meretz, Ra'am, Yesh Atid, Blue and White, Yisrael Beteinu? What does it all mean? If you think Israelis are confused, try coming over here.
Okay, great. I understand. This is not about the debate of the West Bank. These are different parties. We just do a little bit. I do want to go back to the debate over the territories. There's something I believe, very big is happening in Israel. And I feel a little bit responsible for it. I'll try to explain later. But regarding different parties, this hybrid new government has parties on the right, which is Gidon Sa'ar, Tikva Chadasha, and Naftali Bennett Yemina. Those are right-wing parties. Okay. In the center, you have Kachol Lavan, which is led by Benny Gantz, and Yesh Atid, led by my friend Yair Lapid. And then on the left, you have hardcore left-wing parties like Labor and Meretz. Okay. I missed Lieberman. Lieberman, on religious issues, he's very much on the left. And on national security issues, he's very much on the right. So you choose where you want to put this guy. Okay. And then you have Mansour Abbas, Ra'am, which I would love to deliver once a lecture only about Ra'am. It's one of the most interesting phenomena we have. It's the following. It seems like a paradox, but it's not. A combination of Islamism and pragmatism. And it's an interesting brand of pragmatism. It's a pragmatism born out of Islamism. So those are the forces of this new hybrid government that is born out of and one of the reasons why this hybrid government is possible is because annexation of the West Bank is not on the table. Withdrawal from the West Bank is not on the table. The right is giving up its agenda regarding the West Bank. The left is giving up its agenda. And because they're giving up their agendas, now we can work on other problems, other issues in this hybrid government together.
Okay. So you're saying it's complicated. How do you not just say, "Oi, forget it"?
Because here's the thing. Since Israelis agree on most issues, yes, and I'll try to say where I think Israelis actually agree regarding the conflict. They agree, Israelis, when it comes to the conflict, on a concept that I started naming shrinking the conflict. In 2017, I started naming this idea that we're trapped in a false dichotomy. Our whole conversation is trapped in a false dichotomy where the left is speaking about ending the conflict and the right is speaking about managing the conflict. Ending the conflict means solving the problem. Managing the conflict means the status quo, kind of like as keeping things the way they are. Now think about it. Most of our problems in our life, we don't live in this false dichotomy. When it comes to most issues like car accidents, no one says let's end car accidents. And no one says, hey, if we can't end car accidents, let's not doing anything about it. Let's keep things the way they are. Obviously, it's a false dichotomy. When it comes to car accidents, we ask how do we shrink the amount of car accidents. When it comes to crime, we don't want to end crime, and we don't say there's nothing we can do about it. We ask how do we shrink crime. When it comes to the conflicts, one side says let's not do anything about it. The other side says let's end it. Let's treat the conflict like we treat all our problems and ask how can we shrink its size, dramatically shrink the conflict. Most Israelis, I think, agree on this new paradigm shift. And I believe this paradigm shift will be the guiding platform of this new hybrid government.
Okay. There's a lot of questions here, so I'm trying to feed them to you delicately. But one of the first questions that was asked is, and very relevant to American Jews, what do we do when we constantly hear Israel being attacked? Where do we go? What websites do we go to? What do we say? Help.
I'm not the one to ask. No, I mean, because in order to understand how to explain Israel to Americans, you have to intimately understand Americans. I feel like I don't understand Americans so much.
Interesting.
I'll be honest with you. I feel like I wasn't in the States, I think, for more than a year. And I have a feeling that if I come back now, I kind of won't recognize things really change and moods changed and temperaments change. I don't understand the far left so much. I really don't. There's like internal paradoxes there. I don't understand some of the parts of the right. There's something in America that I don't know. So I really don't know. There's certain sensitivities that I don't understand enough. So to explain Israel, you don't have to only understand Israel. You have to understand Americans. And I don't feel like I understand. I used to think I understand Americans. I don't feel like I understand Americans enough to answer that question.
That's brilliant. So here's, but I guess what people were asking, what's the best source of news that you could guide us? Like, because we read the New York Times, we read the Wall Street Journal, we read up here the Boston Globe, whatever. Everything's online, the LA Times. But
listen, I have a very bad answer. The best way to understand a country is using its language. I know it's a bad answer. Yes, there's so I'm not the one to ask. I'm not the one to ask this question.
Great, and I just lost all the questions because you just went away. But give me 1 second. That's technology for you.
No problem.
Well, I have a backup, so it's okay. Okay. Would evacuating the settlements but leaving the security forces in place make any sense? One of our members remembers after the '67 war supporting the occupation, but when the first civilians settled, that was problematic for me as a student of the quote unquote law of war.
Okay, let me just say, evacuation of settlements and keeping the army has two main problems. One, I think it's kind of irrelevant now because the only way you could evacuate, let's say, 180,000 Jews from their homes without destroying the inner unity and structure of Israel is if this decision is passed by like a majority of 70%, like massive majority. Today, 70% of Israelis are against evacuation of settlements. So, because of reasons I explained before. So right now, that's not realistic. Unless, like if you think you could impose an Israel evacuation of 180,000 people. In 2000, let me just explain why. In 2005, Israel evacuated roughly 9,000 people from their homes, from Gaza. And they were told two things. One, they would bring stability, and two, legitimacy. Stability means Gaza will never attack us and will actually pave the way for peace at the West Bank. And two, legitimacy, this was spoken again and again, if a rocket, after we evacuate all the settlements from Gaza, if rockets fly from Gaza, so the international community will completely back us when we retaliate. So then 2008 happens, and Hamas shoots rockets in Israel, and Israel retaliates, and the international community condemns Israel for doing that. So Israel realized it didn't bring stability, it didn't bring legitimacy. And that's what happened when we left Gaza. What happened if we leave the West Bank and not put Sderot under threat, but Tel Aviv under threat? So for all these reasons, it's very hard to convince critical mass of Israelis to evacuate critical mass of settlers in the West Bank.
So since I know you still want to speak to us and sum up, we only have time for probably two more questions. Okay. So I'm picking and choosing. So the one I'm going to ask you now, which is a really good one, I think, is what are your aspirations and your concerns for the new Israeli government, assuming that it...
My aspirations is this government will do three things. One, heal polarization. Two, start working. Our government wasn't working for 3 years. Start working for the people. And three, start representing the unspoken Israeli consensus. When it comes to the conflict, I hope this government will start searching for a broad agreement within the pieces of the government to start working forwards, not towards ending the conflict, but to shrinking it. Means The fact that we can't end the conflict doesn't mean we're paralyzed. It doesn't mean we're neglecting this issue. We're working together to shrink the size of the conflict. That's my aspiration for this new government.
That's wonderful. So there's a lot of questions here that if I ask you, it's going to take another hour. So I'm trying not to. There's one about the Iran. There's one about what happens if the government falls apart and Netanyahu comes back. There's one about the Abraham Accords, but we don't really have time for that, do we? So you know what? Take it away, Micah.
All right. So we're confused. There's a catch. We stay in the West Bank. It's bad news. We leave the West Bank. It's a bad news. What do we do? Paralysis. Now, this confusion led to indifference. What I hope is going to start happening now is the same confusion doesn't need to lead to indifference. It could lead to pragmatism. The shift from confusion to pragmatism. What is it? Pragmatism? Pragmatism when you stop asking, how do I transform reality and create a perfect world? I started thinking kind of like, sometimes I feel like the founding fathers of Israel that built kibbutzim and had this image of a perfect society are different than the founding fathers of America. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. I find that declaration so modest. A more perfect union. Because the unspoken declaration in Israel is, we the people, in order to form the perfect union. And now, what's the difference between you want to form the perfect society versus the more perfect society? Which, by the way, is the difference between Plato's understanding of politics, creating the perfect state, or Aristotle, more perfect, where you compare your life to where you were yesterday, and it seems better, but when you compare it to perfection, it always seems empty. So what does it mean to have a more perfect union? Making life better than it is today, making progress, moving forward, not solving the problem, ending the conflict, bringing peace, not all of that. How that look like? Well, here's what it looks like. It looks like a series of steps that dramatically increase the amount of Palestinian self-governance, and not in return for peace agreement. Let me say this again. A series of steps that dramatically lift the amount of Palestinian autonomy, Palestinian self-governance, and not as a part of a peace treaty. Okay? Now, right now, try to imagine, I want to just try to imagine where the Palestinian Authority is today. So the Palestinian Authority is a autonomy. Now, autonomy is an interesting category because there's different levels of autonomy. There's different grades of autonomy. So let's say if 0 is no autonomy and 100 is a complete sovereign state, the Palestinian Authority, I think, is like 25. Okay, it scores 25. Like if Australia is 99.9, it's still somehow under the crown. So it's like 99% autonomous. And Azerbaijan in the time of Stalin was like 3 points of autonomy. Palestinian Authority is like 25. How can we turn the Palestinian Authority from 25 to 70 to 80? What do I mean? To lift the amount of autonomy, and listen to this carefully. So they have enough power to govern themselves, but not enough to threaten Israel. Now, once you lift their amount of autonomy to a level where they have enough, what an Israeli general called Giora Eiland calls critical mass of governance, enough autonomy to govern themselves independently from Israel, but not enough autonomy to threaten Israel, which means there's things they don't have. Let's bring the Palestinian Authority to that level without, not as a part of a peace treaty. How would that look like? That doesn't look like a peace treaty and a handshake and the White House lawn and Nobel Peace Prize and all that stuff. No, it's not all that. It's something so much more modest. It's what happens. There are certain steps Israel can do that shrink the amount of control that we control, the amount of occupation, the amount that we control the Palestinians, that doesn't shrink the amount of security that Israelis enjoy. Let me just say that again. A step that shrinks the amount that Israelis control the Palestinians without shrinking the amount that Israelis are threatened by Palestinians, okay? So imagine we do one step like that. But imagine we do 20 steps like that. So it accumulates. The impact of every step is small, but the impact of many small steps is big. What does it do? It increases Palestinian autonomy dramatically. That's all we can do without solving the conflict. It's shrinking the conflict. Now, let me just, in very, very broad strokes, explain this point. Palestinian autonomy now is suffering from the fact that it's many autonomous islands that are not connected to each other territorially. Something for another problem, but it's also not connected to the world. Palestinians have a hard time traveling from the West Bank to the world. There's also serious economic problems. They're not free economically. They also have issue that every now and then Israeli special units go into their towns at night and take out what we see as terrorists. I have a question out of those four. What does Israel need for security? Only the last one. But the first three, we could start taking care of now. Right now. Not tomorrow morning. Now. To connect the Palestinian autonomous islands to each other. There's ways to do that. To connect the Palestinian Authority to the world through a railroad that takes them to Haifa, through Allenby Bridge. There's ways to do that. And once they're connected to each other and connected to the world, bang, the amount of self-governance jumps, doubles itself, triples itself. It's dramatic. There's ways for the Palestinian economy to be flourishing and, more importantly, liberated from Israeli control. What happens after we do all that? Three things. One, 2.6 million Palestinians in the West Bank are living now in a political entity that's separate from Israel. Two, that political entity doesn't have the power to threaten Israel, which means we're out of the catch-67. We're not controlling the demographic threat of losing our majority is somehow delayed, but the security threat is also not there. So we control the Palestinians a lot less and not being threatened by them more. And finally, maybe more importantly, for many of you, once we turn the Palestinian autonomy into an entity that is connected to itself, connected to the world, that enjoys economic liberty and prosperity, and they have critical mass of governance, now it's a real autonomy. Now our political imagination expands. Because then people will start saying, hey, this building block, the Palestinian autonomy, we could turn this into a state and have a two-state solution. Someone else might say, you know what? Let's not have a two-state solution, let's have a confederation. One state and two political entities in it. A third person would say, you know what? Let's offer this entity to Jordan. Maybe Jordan will be a confederation. Now the Hashemite state, America has 50 states, Jordan will have 2. The Hashemite state and the Palestinian state. There's another issue of treating like there's Northern Ireland. What I'm saying is, this autonomy is a building block that fits into many solutions, into many endgames. And that's why this idea can be an idea that right-wingers, centrists, and leftists can agree on. Because we do this, and then we argue, what do we do with this? We build a Palestinian autonomy that's connected to itself, connected to its world, governs themselves, and now that this, hopefully it's successful, and this successful entity, what do we do with it? We go into negotiations with it, and now we can have a real debate of what's right-wingers will have their vision, left-wingers will have their vision. Let's have this debate after we upgrade Palestinian autonomy. And in the meantime, we don't have to argue about the end game. We can just play the game. This is why I think this idea could be an idea that unites a hybrid government, because we don't have to agree on the end game. We play the game, we increase Palestinian autonomy, we shrink control over the Palestinians without shrinking Israeli security. Those are things we could all agree on, And then now we have this entity. Now we could start the argument, okay, what's the end game? We're so used to the paradigm. We have to agree on the end game in order to play a game. And as a result, we don't play a game. We're paralyzed because we can't agree on the end game. This is a paradigm shift. There's multiple end games. We'll argue about which one is the right one when we get there. And now there's a lot we can do pragmatically tomorrow morning on the ground. That's the shrinking the conflict paradigm. And I have a hunch you will be hearing these two words, these three words. In Hebrew, it's two words. In English, it's three words. Shrinking the conflict more and more from this new government.
Micah, I was told that you're so good that let him go over. So I hate to I keep on getting the same question over and over again. So I have to ask you, and then we'll end it. So what about Gaza? Should we go back in? I get it for several people, so I know it's on everyone's mind. What should we do? What should Israel do about Gaza?
Gaza is much less complicated. Once we solve the issue of, you see, we have our boys in Gaza. Oren Shaul, Adar, we have people in Gaza. Only once there's a prisoner exchange, we can start speaking rationally about Gaza. Gaza, all Israelis agree about the following. You won't find many Israelis that don't want to rebuild Gaza and for Gaza to enjoy a healthy a health system and a school system and a healthy economy. All Israelis want to rebuild Gaza. Israelis are afraid that if we rebuild Gaza, we rearm Gaza. This is kind of ridiculous that a lot of the funding that goes into Gaza doesn't go to build Gaza. It goes to, well, you know the problem, right? It goes to weapons, to rockets, and we find them Tel Aviv. So how do you rebuild Gaza without rearming Gaza? That's the only question. And there's ways to do this. There's ways to do this. Boats with goods to Gaza could stop at Cyprus. On Cyprus, the Israeli military could check the boat, and then send all those goods to Gaza. Why not? We could do that. There's different ways to do this. So I don't think there's a real problem. We have to find, it's a technical issue. How do we rebuild Gaza without rearming Gaza? It's a technical issue. And most Israelis will agree on a deal with Gaza, but most Israelis don't want to do a deal with Gaza as long as we have some of our people, some of our boys in Gaza.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that was, as always, outstanding. Just to share with you, so when you come to Temple Emmanuel, as you always do, I think you've been there, I don't know, 16 times. We are a conservative movement and part of the United Synagogue, and the Men's Club, which I've been very involved with. This is the umbrella organization. So you are talking to people all over North America, from up in Canada to all the way out to Southern California.
Not only men, it's just a word.
It is men. It's the Federation Jewish Men's Club, but we definitely have women on the call right now.
Okay.
We definitely have women on. We have a sisterhood, which is the
Great.
other branch. So your words, your Torah, your wisdom has gone to over 100 people today and is being recorded. Certainly we appreciate you taking the time, because I know you have a lot going on right now over in Israel. We all hope for peace. We all hope to come, not just that you come see us, but that we can come see you.
Amen.
Very, very
Amen.
soon.
All right.
So Micah, thank you. We look forward to hearing from you again. You're always online. You're always fabulous. See you soon.
Thank you all. Bye-bye. Shalom from Israel.
Shalom.